Chapter 28, Steering Systems and Integral Steering Gears, Day 2, Video 4, Complaints. So when we are dealing with a steering complaint, driver comes in, issues a complaint about hard steering. One of the things we need to do is to question the driver so that we can figure out under what conditions he's having this complaint, hot or cold, loaded or unloaded, turn to the right hard and turns to the left easy, that sort of thing, so that we can try and narrow down what the problem could be, because it may be the case where we need to replicate the conditions so that we can experience that steering difficulty. Always want to start out visually with inspection of the fluid levels, hoses, linkage, and inspect for leaks. So power steering level, all right, make sure it's got the fluid in it. See if the fluid is burnt, right, from overheating. The oil may break down, the properties of the oil would break down and then not produce the pressure that it needs. So maybe something simple like that. A leak, we're now low on fluid. Checking for tire inflation pressures, tire conditions. Talk about the power steering level, and now we need to check the suspension systems also. So we're going to do all these things before we dive into checking our power steering system. There's all these other things that would affect the hard steering. Say like we've got a condition where it's hard steering only under a load and when we are at low speed. When it's unloaded, low speed, no steering complaints. So that may lead us into looking at the fifth wheel plate. Maybe no grease on the fifth wheel plate. When it's loaded, more friction there. It's not allowing it to turn easily. That could lead to a steering complaint problem. Low tire pressure could cause pulling to the right or to the left. And then tire condition, a tire that's a blown out tire or has missing some tread could cause some problems like that. Or even if the suspension has shifted, can cause steering complaints. So we want to eliminate all those things before we start trying to analyze the power steering. Checking our kingpins, springs, leaf shackles, suspension height and suspension U-bolts, airbag suspension, leaf spring suspension, drag links, tie rod ends. Has this been getting proper lubrication? And our tie rod ends are binding. The steering stops being not properly adjusted. The gear mounting being loose. That would cause that steering gear to shift back and forth. And then steering column to slip joints and the universal joints. If we've got excessive play in there, would cause some steering difficulties. If the universal joints are not phased properly, they will cause binding in the steering also. So visual checks of all those components. So the steering complaints, and kind of define these. Hard steering, lots of resistance to steering right or to left. Binding is where we will turn easily for part of the turn, and then it becomes very difficult, right? So it's binding up. Bump steer is when we have we hit a bump in the road or a pothole or something like that, and the tire drops down into that pothole. When it comes back up, it changes the steering slightly. So when we hit that bump, it pulls to the right, or we hit that bump and it pulls to the left. We call that bump steer. Shimmy, when the tires they kind of vibrate back and forth at a certain speed, could cause a steering problem. Excessive turning radius, we can have our steering stops not properly adjusted, and we come to it comes to the steering lock, and now the tires will not turn the proper amount. Oversteer and understeer. So oversteer means you turn the steering wheel very little and it responds like you've turned the steering wheel a lot, right? It's oversteering, overcompensating for what you're steering. Understeer, you turn the steering wheel a lot and the truck turns in the corner very little. You have to continue, you have to turn the steering wheel more than what you should. That would be understeer. And then pulling or wandering, pulling to the right, so that you're always having to compensate by pulling to the left on the steering wheel. Or the wandering is where there's looseness in the steering wheel, so you'll have to hold pressure to the right, and then it turns to the right, and then you have to turn back to the left. You're constantly compensating for the directional control of the truck. And then noise, either a kind of a gear noise from the pump, something like that. Could be where the pump is no longer creating the pressure that it needs.